I didn't know my father, and my owner had separated me from my mother. Risking severe punishment, my mother had to walk 12 miles just to visit me for a few hours. When I was 10 years old, I was sent to live with my master's relatives in Baltimore. This proved to be the miracle that saved me from a life on the plantation and allowed me to lay the foundation for my future freedom and success. As soon as I stepped into the bustling streets of Fells Point, I knew I had entered a different world. African Americans walked the streets with many of the same freedoms as whites, and it was in Baltimore that I came to believe in the equality of human beings. My childhood was spent playing in the cobblestone streets with both African Americans and whites alike. My playmates later became my workmates when, as a 10-year-old, I went to work making supplies and repairing tools for ship caulkers. After Miss Sophie, my master's wife, began teaching me to read, I could not stop. My master made her stop because it was illegal to teach a slave to read. But I still worked to teach myself to read and write, trading bread for reading lessons in the shipyard and using old school books by candlelight at night. The more I learned, the more I wanted to learn, from reading classic books to playing the violin.
Although I, Isaac Myers, also grew up in Baltimore, my early life was dramatically different from that of Mr. Douglas, partially because I am 17 years younger than he, and I was born to free parents. In those days, African Americans could not attend school like whites, so my parents sent me to a private day school to learn to read and write. My formal schooling continued till I was 16, when I began my apprenticeship as a caulker in the Baltimore shipyards. Caulking was a respected job. It enabled the ships to be watertight. I soon mastered the skills of caulking and began to supervise the work of others.
Although my scholarly interests were wide-ranging, I spent most of my teenage years working in the shipyards, eventually being hired out by my master. But as I learned more about abolition and the anti-slavery movement, I became more independent and rebellious because I wanted to be a free man. The death of my master required me to be returned to the Eastern Shore, where once again I experienced plantation slavery. The work that I did in the fields gave me an understanding of what many other agricultural enslaved workers experienced day in and day out.
I worked in the shipyard from the time I was 16 until I turned 25. I married and had my 3 children during that time. When I reached 25, I left the shipyards, worked in a grocery business, and even ran my own store for 5 years. That forced me to learn a number of the business skills that would be useful in my later undertakings. I returned to the shipyards when I was 30. During the 1850s, the environment of the shipyards had changed, with large numbers of Irish and German immigrants coming to Baltimore looking for work. The immigrants were angry that African Americans were getting the jobs that they wanted, and the competition developed into tensions and riots. In the end, most African Americans, no matter how talented, were fired from their shipyard jobs.
This tension was not new to the shipyards. All of us who worked in the port were faced with unemployment and discrimination as the hostility grew. It got so bad that I was badly beaten by a group of white workers at my shipyard in 1835, when Isaac was just a baby. No one was held responsible. Soon after my beating, I was forced to move to another shipyard in order to be able to continue working. I thought that the situation in Baltimore was murderous. It had become the epicenter of the racial difficulties of the age, and I was living in the middle of it.
As the environment in Baltimore's harbor became more stressful, African Americans turned to each other for support. The religious community became more central to my everyday life by the time I was 35. I taught Sabbath school at my Bethel AME church, which allowed me to meet many of the African Americans in the neighborhoods surrounding the harbor. Through my conversations with these men, we decided that the African American maritime community had to provide for itself. As a result of these discussions, we created the Chesapeake Marine Railway and Dry Dock Company, the first African American owned marine railway in the U.S. All 15 founders of the company were members of the Bethel AME Church with me, or the Sharp Street United Methodist Church.
The Bethel AME Church, which still exists today, was a source of inspiration for me. My conversion to Christianity came as I was exploring the anti-slavery movement, adding to my belief in the freedom of labor and equality. My teenage years were spent working very hard, either as a plantation worker or in the shipyard. While my work on the dock was a point of pride, it frustrated me that my earnings from my hard work would be given to my master. It made me yearn for freedom even more. This was when I decided to escape and seek my freedom. I ran away to New York, where I became a speaker for the anti-slavery movement, as well as a supporter of the women's liberty movement. I eventually claimed my freedom and began touring the country and the world, supporting abolition, freedom of labor, and other equality issues.
The freedom of labor movement became a central focus of my life, as it was for Frederick Douglass. In addition to creating the largest African-American operated business of the time, I served as the head of the Baltimore Colored Caucus Trade Union in an effort to better relations between white and African-American workers. The African-American community offered me a tremendous amount of support through the labor movement and my involvement in the Prince Hall Masons. I spent the rest of my life working to support equality and freedom for the oppressed through religious, civic, and political activities. I received a federal appointment to serve the U.S. government as a messenger to the Customs Service. I published a play and a newspaper, and was named as the secretary of the Baltimore Republican Campaign Committee during the later years of my life. But even with all I did, I still trace my beginnings back to the Baltimore shipyards. The museum you are in right now is a stone's throw from where the Chesapeake Marine Railway and Dry Dock Company was. So although the skyline of Baltimore has changed, you are walking in many of the same places that Frederick Douglass and I walked as you explore the Maritime Park.
After I received my freedom, I spent time all over the country doing as much as I could to support equality. I wrote 3 autobiographies, each one telling more and more about myself, and they are still in publication today. I led the Colored National Labor Union, named U.S. Marshal of D.C. I served as an advisor to President Lincoln. President Harrison named me Minister of Haiti. Despite all my travels and experiences, I still consider Baltimore to be my hometown. It was in the shipyards of Baltimore that I began my long journey towards freedom. Without the support of the Black community, both socially and religiously, I would not have been able to overcome the difficulties that I faced as a slave and become the man that I am.
Now that you've heard a little bit about the challenges and accomplishments of these 2 extraordinary men, we're sure you're ready to get started exploring Frederick Douglass Isaac Myers Maritime Park. Step back in time with us to experience this intriguing chapter in Baltimore's maritime history. Thank you, and enjoy your visit.
All right. I'm George Harris, King George's Landing at Historic Fells Point, and you're on the Frederick Douglass Path to Freedom walking tour at the Frederick Douglass Isaac Myers Museum with the Boys Latin Youth School. Learning a lot here today, Baltimore. and whoever's watching from around the world. Sometimes you can't just see things as they are today. You have to vision what they can look like tomorrow. Who knew? From slavery to CEO of the first black bank in America that was renamed back to its original name in Washington, D.C., across the street from the White House, Frederick Douglass, CEO of the Freedmen's Bank, the first black bank, which today is known as the Treasury Annex Building across the House of the United States, on the mall, across the street from the White House. Most people know Frederick Douglass is in a lot of other capacities, but not as an extraordinary businessman and CEO of the first black bank in America, known as the Treasury Annex Building. That $57 million that we accumulated 3 years after Frederick Douglass became the CEO of the bank that Lincoln gave so that they could learn about money, the soldiers that served this country, that must be returned. That must be returned, not just the name, but in deposits, dollars, stock, and the waterfront property, the assets that were held by those depositors from around the world. Because that's how a lot of the Black Wall Streets were built and developed, by a lot of those well-to-do, hardworking, free men and women.
I listened to both of them last night.
What's that?
I listened to both of them last night.
Really?
Yeah.
See you again. Bye for now.
1963.